hard to get around in a 6-foot town.
Well, good morning, everybody. Happy Friday to one and all. Very much excited about the weekend, as I'm sure you are as well. And even though we have a lot to get to, and I have every intention of getting to it, I know that we have started a little late once again. Again, I'm working through some technical difficulties. Hopefully, we should be able to resolve them before too long. But what's going on right now that I really do want to impress upon you the importance of this, and having recently gone through this myself, I can really understand this in a way that I think most people unfortunately cannot. But we all have had somebody in our life that has gone through cancer, whether it's a friend, a neighbor, a church member, a family member, whatever it may be. And it is a horrific experience. I mean, once you've sat there getting chemo, once you've been in the chair yourself, it does put a different perspective on things. And that's part of the reason that I feel very compelled to come to you today to talk to you about St. Jude Children's Hospital. And right now, our radio station is doing a telethon. So this telethon that they're doing right now, if you are to donate to it, it would do a world of good to help out these kids. There are very few causes that I believe are worthy of this kind of attention. I've done a lot of research on different charities because when I donate, I want to make sure that my money is going to the right place. There's a handful of charities that you'll notice that I recommend, and I'm very, very skeptical of charities. I know that there's a lot of cost that goes to overhead. There's some that your money is not really going to help the people that you think they are. St. Jude is one of the good ones, and I would not be recommending it to you if it were not a really, really good charity. They do have some overhead, they have some administrative costs, but by and large, the vast majority of the money that you're giving actually goes to help kids and helps to fund research that will help make future kids healthier. And so it's just an incredibly worthy cause. And as somebody who has sat in the chair and has gone through chemo and had those mornings where you wake up and you just, you feel almost like you didn't really want to, that you almost would have rather just stayed asleep all day. And I mean, just feeling like that on a consistent basis, it is just not easy to go through. And right now, with Christmas coming up, there are families that are going to spend a substantial amount of their time around the holidays not visiting family or giving gifts. Not that there's anything wrong with those things at all. In fact, those are really good things that I intend to do this year. But they're going to spend a lot of their time around Christmas in a hospital with their kid because they're undergoing cancer treatment. And so because of that, while you are well within your right to, and I encourage you to go out and celebrate this season, I do want you to also think about those that aren't able to celebrate because of the things in their life. And St. Jude is just a great facility. They do all kinds of research to help make kids better and improve cancer treatments. And a lot of the research that they have done has actually improved cancer treatment for other people, including myself, because testicular cancer is a child's cancer. A lot of people that are under the age of 18 do get it. And so because of that, a lot of the research that was done at St. Jude helped make my medical treatment better. And so when it comes to combating this disease of cancer, giving money to St. Jude goes a long way in helping us figure out a cure one day. And hopefully that will be the case, that you don't in the future have parents that are having to take off work and sit with their child at 10 o'clock in the morning watching their kid have to go through all this pain and suffering. Because as difficult as it was for me to go through it as a strong, mostly healthy with the exception of cancer, 28-year-old man, I can only imagine how rough it would be as a little kid having to go through that. And so please donate to that. The telethon is going to be going on until 7 o'clock tonight. If you need the details later on, you can listen to our sister station, 95.1 The Fox, right here in Montgomery. Of course, they're on iHeart as well. If you want to donate, the number is 1-800-592-3449. That's 1-800-592-3449. So if you do want to call in, I highly recommend you do so. You can also donate at WXFX.com. That's the call letters for the Fox, WXFX. Any donation will be appreciated, no matter how small, and you can rest assured that a large portion of that donation, whether you're giving $10 or whether you're giving $10,000, regardless of what you're giving, you can rest assured that the majority of your donation is going to help sick kids that really need it. And so I would highly, highly encourage you to do that. So that being said, even though we have that very somber note to start out with, today is kind of a weird day for me. And the reason that it's a weird news day is because, oddly enough, all the news is good. I mean, there's negative aspects to it, and there's one story that we're going to cover that isn't necessarily good a little bit later in the Daily Dose of Stupid. But I'm just looking through the headlines today, and it's really strange that I view every single one of these stories in a positive light. Maybe there are some people that don't. Maybe there are some people that take a different perspective and think because of that these stories wouldn't necessarily constitute being quote-unquote good news stories. But, I got to say it's pretty refreshing, because normally what we're doing is we're going through and talking about how terrible things are in the world and pointing out the problems, and I try not to do that too much. I try not to harp on it so much that it becomes a problem. But, there are problems out there, and I'm a news guy, so I got to tell you about them. Today, though, I don't know. It's just a strange news day. I was looking through this. I'm really glad that most of these news stories are being reported. And the first one, which I think is actually a really good move, is our Attorney General in the state of Alabama, one Steve Marshall, has vowed that he is now going to take over the Hoover investigation. He formally announced this yesterday. So this is a total takeover of the investigation on both incidents. So, in other words, what I mean by that is, because you'll remember, there's sort of two facets to the Hoover Mall, the Galleria Mall shooting. You've got the first facet, which is the two victims that were shot, the shooting that took place, and the man that was arrested in Atlanta. That's the first facet. The second facet, which may or may not be connected, it's been kind of fuzzy as to whether or not there was a one-to-one connection there. Now, we know that the guy, regardless of whether he's a good guy or a bad guy, Bradford, E.J. Bradford Jr., whether he was a good guy or bad guy or not remains to be seen. But the reason that he had his firearm out, presumably, was either he was involved in the shooting or he was trying to defend people from the shooting. Either way, the shooting is the reason that he had his firearm out. So these are tangentially connected, but they're really two different cases. Because let's just say, for the sake of argument, that E.J. Bradford was a good guy and the cop was unjustified in his shooting of him. Again, I'm not saying that's the case. I'm saying use it as a hypothetical. If that's the case, you have to treat these two as different cases, because one involves a criminal shooting at people and hurting innocent people, and the other one is someone completely unconnected to it. But there were police reports, and again, the reporting has changed a little bit because we have new information, and that's not a cover-up, that's not lying, that's just you were reporting based on the facts that you thought you had at the time. New facts came to light and they had to change the narrative, and that's perfectly acceptable. In fact, that's good. I would rather, be it police officers or anybody else in a position of power, to be able to come up with new information and say, you know what, that was incorrect, we need to correct ourselves, than I would them say, you know what, we were incorrect, let's cover that up and not tell people about it. So obviously, the changing narrative is something of concern, but I don't understand people that will make it a big sticking point that the narrative changed, because if the narrative was different than the original narrative they put out there, I would want them to have the sense of mind and the sense of fair play to be able to say, you know what, we screwed up. We thought it was this thing. It turns out it's this other thing. So I say all that to make clear to you, these are actually two separate cases, or at least potentially two separate cases, and unless Bradford himself was involved in the shooting in some way, and this was part of that, but we don't know that yet. So they are, at the very least, potentially two separate cases. And so the Attorney General's office has said that there is going to be a total takeover. They're going to be taking both of these cases, both the police use of force against E.J. Bradford and also the shooter himself, which they picked up from Atlanta. You remember we talked about the U.S. Marshal's office being able to pick that up, which, by the way, I realize that can get a little confusing. Steve Marshall is our Attorney General. His office is very different from the U.S. Marshal's office, which picked up that criminal. The U.S. Marshals, of course, are a federal agency. The Attorney General's office being the state agency, the highest law enforcement agency for the state of Alabama. Under them are the state Bureau of Investigations and ALEA and all those other branches of law enforcement in the state of Alabama. So Jefferson County DA Danny Carr has requested this due to a conflict of interest, which I gotta say, even though I don't know anything about Carr other than this particular incident, it seems to me like Carr is doing the right thing here for a couple of reasons, because whenever you are in charge, whether you're a district attorney, an attorney general, whenever you're charged with doing an investigation, you need to only do so if you believe that not only is there no bias, but there would not even be the perception of bias. So in other words, let's just say Danny Carr is 100% straight arrow, honest guy, wouldn't allow his biases to play into this investigation at all. Well, maybe that was the case, but because there are a couple of things that we're about to go over, there would at least be the perception of impropriety, the perception of bias. And the reason that our legal standard is you don't even have the perception of bias is because we don't want people after the fact coming down and saying, well, he could have potentially had this conflict of interest. It could not be, but it also could be, and we can't prove it one way or the other, ergo we err on the side of judgment, and we throw that one out the window. Because of that, it saves time, saves money, and it makes sense to have the first investigation that is done, have it be somebody that actually does not have a conflict of interest, so people can't come back later and sort of challenge that narrative or challenge that investigation on grounds of potential bias. And because of this, I think this makes this is 100% a good move. This makes sense to me. And the attorney general there in Jefferson County, he actually, oddly enough, potentially has conflicts of interest on both sides of the issue. Now, this is unusual, but he is suggesting that there would be the perception of bias from both sides, because he evidently, because he is the attorney general, has a close relationship with the police force and several of the officers involved, and there are people that are suggesting that he would want to make sure that this is not a unlawful use of force incident by a police officer to bolster his own political career and make his own, political hay while the sun is shining. In other words, they're suggesting that he has some kind of motivation for doing this because he has relationships with the police department. Now, I think that's a little bit of a stretch, but I can understand, like I said, the legal standard is merely the perception of bias. And so I get why, because of this, he would say that he may have a potential, at least, of bias being displayed here, but also, oddly enough, he also has connections to the protesters that are so vehemently opposed to having any kind of semblance of justice, just going ahead, let's assume the police officer is guilty even though we have no idea who he was, we have no video evidence, we're just going to assume that he's guilty and going to protest what has been doing and start calling for justice even though justice may have already been served. We don't know. So because of that, apparently there were pictures of Attorney General Carr circulating around the internet with Carlos Chavez Jr., who is, you may remember, basically the guy heading the protest. So there's pictures of the two of them going around the internet, and because of that, there is at least the perception of impropriety, the perception of bias. And because of that, I think that Danny Carr made the right call, the district attorney of Jefferson County, saying, you know what? The State Department ought to handle it. Steve Marshall ought to be the one handling this because I can't do it. It at least appears as though there is bias there. And by the way, Marshall asserted that in this particular release where he announced that his office would be taking over, he said right there, well, I don't believe that Carr actually is compromised. I don't believe that he actually is biased. But because I could at least see how somebody might perceive it that way, I'm going to go ahead and take over just to eliminate any doubt. And when it comes to this particular decision, I think this is probably best for everybody involved. I think it's best for the Bradford family. I think that it's best for the family of the police officer, whomever they may be, and the police officer himself. I think that this is a good way to sort of remove a lot of that doubt, a lot of that seed of doubt, because there might be some bias, by having Attorney General Marshall take over. So the reason that I say this is that Marshall is perceived largely, probably not exclusively, but largely as a very fair-minded, unbiased individual because he's bipartisan. You may recall that he just recently won an election as a Republican, and that is certainly true, but he is somebody who used to be a Democrat. I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, but what I am saying is that helps him with this perception of being unbiased. The fact that in Alabama there were a lot of Democrats that switched over to Republicans, that is certainly true, but in this particular case, because Marshall's was more recent, I think that people are going to be more willing to look at him as being a bipartisan figure. More so than if this particular investigation had taken place closer to home. And when it comes to Marshall, Marshall has no reason to protect the police officer. He just doesn't. There is no motivation for him to protect the police officer. There's also no motivation for him to convict the police officer, and that is why he is the right person, and his office contains the right people to sort of head this investigation. I think that this was the right move by the district attorney and the attorney general. And some people, I will say this though, they're going to be upset no matter what. No matter what happens. There are going to be some people, a contingency that is going to be upset regardless of the outcome. If we come out with a verdict that says the police officer was wrong, he was the one that was guilty, there are going to be people that come out and are going to say that that was incorrect, and they're going to side with the police officer regardless of where the evidence happens to lead. On the other side, and I think that there's probably more of these people, on the other side, you are also going to have people like these protesters that have already decided the police officer is guilty no matter what happens or no matter what the evidence shows. And because of that, they are now asserting that basically the investigation doesn't matter. We've already decided he's guilty. We don't have to have a trial. We don't have to see any evidence. The guy was wrong regardless of what happened. And those people, they are also going to be upset no matter what the findings of this particular investigation are. That's just the way that it is. But I think that having Attorney General Marshall's office take this over is going to mitigate that to a degree. In other words, you're still going to have people that are upset no matter what, but because Attorney General Marshall is taking over, I think that that's going to be lessened somewhat because of his bipartisan sort of reputation and his reputation in general. I think that this is going to be a really good move for the Attorney General's office. And hopefully what this means, and this is what I'm sort of chomping at the bit for, is that we get a video. I said a while back the fact that they have not released video footage yet seems suspicious to me. And I've also said that I think that, especially if it exonerates the police officer, it's going to sort of take the wind out of the sails of the protesters, and so they should go ahead and release it. But the fact that they haven't done so yet, to me, seems a little suspicious. And so what I'm hoping happens now is that because Attorney General Marshall's office has taken over it, I'm hoping what that means is that now maybe we're going to get a video. And I really hope that that takes place, but we'll just have to wait and see. We just don't know yet. Now, in some international news. Now, you guys remember that I have this sort of good Trump, bad Trump grading card. And I'm not going to lie, it was largely based off of things that happened in the primary, that there would be some things that I really liked about Trump. There would be some things that I really hated about Trump. And so the good Trump, bad Trump thing, that was kind of developed by my conservative brethren. I didn't come up with the idea, but this is a good Trump day. Trump is really just coming up all roses right now on a couple of issues. You guys know that I am as much a free trader as anybody has ever been. I am a fervent advocate of free trade. Zero tariffs on absolutely everything. That has been my mantra from the beginning. And because of that, the president and I have been at odds. A lot. And that's probably the single biggest problem that I have with the Trump administration is their use of tariffs. However, there have been people suggesting, and the president himself has sort of hinted at this a couple of times, especially with Larry Kudlow, one of his economic advisors who is another free trader. There has been this suggestion that the president's goal in using these tariffs all along was not to actually keep the tariffs there, that they were a temporary measure in order to bring down trade barriers. That, in other words, what we were going to do is we were going to raise tariffs as a negotiating tool, as sort of a stick instead of a carrot, to try to bludgeon other countries into bringing down their tariffs. Now, I said from the beginning, I think that's a stupid idea. I don't think it's going to work. and all it does is hurt us in the meantime. However, there is some evidence today. I don't want to jump the gun here and say that it's proof, but there is some evidence today that I may well have been wrong. China has announced this morning that they are going to put a temporary hiatus on tariffs. Not a total hiatus, it's more like a lessening. It would probably be a better way to describe it. But the current rate for tariffs on American automobiles in China is 25%. So if you're buying a $20,000 car, you're paying an extra $5,000 on it in China. And so you're essentially paying $25,000 for a $20,000 American car. And so that's an absolutely ridiculous level of tax when you're talking about this. And it really is stupid. And again, I'm a free trader for everybody. I don't think that we should have tariffs, and I don't think other countries should have tariffs either. I think that it only winds up hurting their consumer. And that is true. It may lessen our market reach to a degree, but primarily it hurts the citizens of that country. However, China has announced today, and I didn't expect this. I thought that China was going to be the one that would be the toughest for Trump to convince to get rid of the tariffs, because he has had some limited success in the European Union, and I do want to give him credit for that. But because he threatened more tariffs on the EU decided that it was okay for them to back off on some of their tariffs on American goods. And so that was a win. That was a good thing, and I did report that. But I said that I don't think it's going to work with China because they have such a different mindset. They think like 500 years in the future. They don't think in the present. They think as a collective as opposed to being individuals. And so it's because of that, tariffs make more sense to them. Now, it's a bad idea regardless of what country implements it, but it makes more sense for them because they have that mindset. However, and this is really surprising to me, as of January 1st, they have announced that they're going to be backing off from 25% tariffs on American automobiles to 15%. Now, it is possible, this is a head fake, it is possible they have no intention of keeping these on here. They're just doing it as a measure of goodwill for the next 3 months, trying to get a more favorable deal done. But there's kind of some evidence to suggest the contrary. They said they, quote, want to reach a mutually beneficial agreement. Now, that's translated, of course, because it was originally in Chinese. But they said they want to reach a mutually beneficial agreement. And this is the most encouraging one, CNN was reporting earlier today, actually on our station because we're a CNN affiliate. Well, we're a CNN news partner, not an affiliate. But anyway, CNN was announcing this today, that China has said that they are working towards a goal with America of no tariffs. China said that. Now, that's a big deal. And if that is the case, if what we wind up with eventually, once all the smoke is cleared and all of the politics and the news hype has kind of gone away, is that we get America with 0% tariffs on China's goods and China with 0% tariffs on American goods, that is going to make both countries more prosperous, more wealthy. It is going to bring costs down substantially for both countries involved. And if that is eventually what happens, I'll eat my words. Bravo Donald Trump for using tariffs as a bludgeon to get tariffs down. Now, it's counterintuitive. It made no sense to me at the time, and it still may fail. This is a 3-month lessening of tariffs. It's not getting rid of tariffs. It's not even lessening tariffs permanently. But if we wind up with more free trade with China, and at the end of the day, the tariffs on both sides are lower than they were when they started, this is a win for the Trump administration. And I will be gleefully happy to be proven wrong. I said the same thing about the border wall. We talked about that a lot this week. If Trump actually winds up building the border wall, if he actually gets the funding for it and we have a physical wall between us and Mexico, yeah, I'll admit I was wrong, and I'll be happy to do so because I want the border wall. And the same thing can be said about tariffs. I've been preaching about free trade and talking about how Trump was wrong to enact tariffs this whole time. But you know what? If he winds up at the end of the day, when he leaves office, that we have 0% tariffs between us and China, wow, that is a huge win, and he deserves a massive, massive pat on the back for that. I hope that that's the case. I really, really do. Because if this is moving towards that, then that is true. This is not a victory yet. I don't want to overplay this. But if this winds up panning out that way, then that is a really, really great outcome. And this is a good sign, a very encouraging sign that that may be what actually happens. So kudos to the Trump administration for that. It's not an accomplishment yet, but it is a sign that a big accomplishment is on the way. And I hope that that sign happens to be accurate. If so, I will gladly come on the airwaves and say, you know what? I was wrong on that. Trump was right. And I will be happy to do so. So that being said, we're going to go ahead and take a quick break, and then we're going to be back because there is another positive Trump story. I'm telling you, this is just a day for good Trump. Usually we get a mix. We get some good Trump, some bad Trump. Today has been pretty much all good Trump. And, you know, it's only 10 o'clock in the morning, or sorry, it's only 11 o'clock in the morning. Maybe Trump could screw it up, but right now he is having a very good news day. Something else that Trump has done that I think is a big win for the White House. I don't know that it's a big win in the sense that it's going to help him politically at all, but culturally, I think this is a good thing. First of all, Trump has just out and out canceled the media Christmas party. So for those of you who aren't aware, there's a big deal that happens every single year. It's been going on since, I believe, the Nixon administration, if I'm not mistaken. And every year, the media, the press, the White House press conference gets together, people that cover the White House, journalists, that kind of thing. And they all show up at the White House and they have a Christmas party. It's a really big thing. And then the president and the first lady will pose for about 2 hours and just take pictures and have a brief chat with each of the journalists. And it's a really big perk for them because they get a nice picture of them with the president. They get free dinner and hors d'oeuvres and all of that, all provided for, by the way, at the expense of the taxpayer, of course. And what Trump has done this year is he's just out and out canceled it. Now, last year, he sort of made an appearance and made some brief remarks and then went on. So he did attend it, but he didn't do the big to-do that most presidents have. This year, he's just flat out saying, you know what, we're just not doing it. I think that's a really good thing. And I say that as someone who is a member of the media. I mean, that's who I am. That's what I got my major in. That's my job. That's part of who I am. And yet I'm saying, you know, I don't understand why journalists, whether you're covering the White House or anything else, expect to get all these government freebies and perks and be treated by an elite. And I realize that there are people that are upset by this, but quite frankly, I don't care. And I'm not just saying this because of the liberal media, because of course, you know, you've got CNN and MSNBC and CBS and all the alphabet soup networks. I'm not even talking about just them. Why should even the Fox News or the Blaze TV correspondents, why should they get free food funded for by the taxpayer at an elaborate Christmas party at the White House? I don't understand that. And when you've got people in this country that are spending their hard-earned taxpayer dollars to go to the funding of the functions of government, now with foreign diplomats, that kind of thing, I get that. You got to schmooze a little bit because it's good for foreign relations. That actually furthers a benefit to the American people. That I understand. I even understand it being a little bit lavish when it comes to things like that. I don't think they should get too crazy. But when it comes to the press are American citizens. They can buy their own dinner. I don't have to buy it for them. And so I actually think that this is a really, really good thing that is being done. I've never understood why we have these elaborate parties for people just because they happen to be journalists. We treat them as though there's some kind of intellectual giant because they happen to be a White House correspondent. And I think if anything, Jim Acosta proved you don't exactly have to have an elevator that goes all the way to the top to be a White House correspondent. I'm not saying he's a blithering idiot, but he certainly is not doing his research and doesn't know. We showed you that clip of him arguing with the president where he was wrong on every single count. And yet people still held him as a hero. So Jim Acosta is sort of probably a catalyst for this. But the president has kind of had this relationship with the press ever since the beginning. He flat out canceled the White House Correspondents' Dinner, which, again, I think that was a good thing too. He decided not to attend it. More power to him. And I really think that one of the things that people like about Donald Trump is that he does not treat journalists and people in the media as though he has to kowtow to them. He doesn't treat them as though they're somebody that's valuable. Time, for example, Time magazine. And Jim Acosta was in this list, if I'm not mistaken. Time magazine put together a list of Person of the Year, which is funny because I think that Time doesn't understand that person is singular. But Time magazine, their big thing this year where they do Person of the Year every year, this year their Person of the Year, it should be People of the Year if they're going to do a list every year, but their Person of the Year was a group of journalists they called the Guardians. Now, the press operates and purports a function of government that I think is really important. I think a free press is incredibly important to establishing a free country. And so I'm not just down on the press, I'm down on the way that they conduct themselves. I'm not saying that a free press is not an important thing. I'm saying the way that they have used that freedom has been done incorrectly. That they are using their freedom of speech and their freedom of the press and their access to the White House and access to other elected officials irresponsibly. So I'm not dogging the press as a theory, I'm dogging the press as it exists today and the way that they are conducting themselves. That's the problem that I have with them. They have done everything within their power to destroy anyone that disagrees with their political agenda. Trump is probably the person they hate the most, but we know this, they've been doing it long before Trump came on the political scene. And they've had this bias for much longer than Trump has been around. And they act as though just because Trump came around, he's the one that started demonizing the media, and he's the one that caused conservatives to not like the media. That's been going on forever. Brent Brozell, I mean, he put together his group specifically to point out the liberal media bias. This has been going on for decades. And so, I mean, Trump's probably the loudest voice about it, but the point is, the media has not exercised their liberty properly. They have abused the power and the influence that they have been given to suit a political agenda. And the fact that Donald Trump can look at them and say, you know what? You're not very good at this. You're not doing your job. You're not serving the people. You're only in it for ratings and in it for yourself. And so, you know what? I don't care what you think. That is an attractive thing, even to people that were skeptics of Trump, including myself. And the fact that he does not treat them as some kind of elites that should be pampered and should be praised because of how brilliant they are, that's something that the American people really like, and it's probably the primary reason, one of the main reasons, that he wound up winning the primary in the first place, is because he said to people in the media, people at universities, he didn't treat them as though they were gods that he had to bow down to. And that is a very attractive thing. So, that being said, I do want to talk about something that it's good news, but I don't want to overplay how good it is. And I know that probably seems strange to you, but you may understand a little bit when I give you the details of the story. So Congress has now voted on legislation, and it looks like this legislation is going to pass. It's kind of sailing through the congressional system right now, through the House, through the Senate. It seems as though this is going to wind up becoming law, and I assume that President Trump will sign it into law. I have no reason to believe that he wouldn't. Congress now is going to have to settle their sexual assault allegations on their own dime. So we're just talking about taxpayer dollars that got wasted on the media. You want to talk about a ridiculous level of waste when it comes to taxpayer money. I don't think that the dollar amount was that much, but the fact that we were spending money on this just absolutely makes me sick to my stomach. There was actually a fund put aside for Congress to settle sexual assault allegations. And the fact that this did not become one of the biggest scandals, the biggest stories of the year, to me is very indicative of where the press's loyalties and biases lie. I mean, you find out that Congress has been putting aside a rainy day fund specifically to pay to defend the alleged assaulters when it comes to government officials, that they actually get money from the taxpayer to be able to pay their legal fees to defend themselves against sexual assault allegations is beyond stupid. I mean, there is no level of speech that I can come up with at this particular moment to describe how disgusting that is. And yet, it's what's going on, and apparently had been going on for a number of years. Yet despite this, we're just now getting a law that actually would say, you know what, Congress members, you're going to have to pay your own way if you get accused of sexual assault. And the government is intended, and this is really where our head needs to be. Our government, the purpose of government, the stated purpose and the philosophical purpose of government is that it is intended to protect us, the citizen, whom the government derives its just powers from the lawbreaker. That's really, when you look at it, when you boil it all down to what the government does, that's the only real responsibility that the government has. That's really all it is. It is to protect us from the lawbreaker. That's its primary function. And yet, because of this particular fund that Congress had put together, essentially what government was doing was protecting the lawbreaker from us. Now, again, these were allegations to start out with, and so we don't know that the allegation actually whether the alleged act took place. But they knew that at least there was a potential that that person was a lawbreaker, and they were using taxpayer money to fund the defense of that. Well, then you've got government working literally backwards. Instead of government protecting the U.S. citizen from the lawbreaker, we now have the government protecting the lawbreaker from the U.S. citizen. And the fact that taxpayer money was going to this was just ridiculous. And this was not an isolated incident. There were over 200 cases of this happening. And one example is Representative Blake Fertenhold, I believe is the way to say it. He's a Republican from Texas. He spent over $84,000 of taxpayer money defending himself. $84,000 of your tax money to defend his sexual assault allegations. Maybe he was innocent. I really don't know. But whether he was innocent or guilty, he still needs to be footing his own bill for that. And he has vowed to pay that money back to the U.S. government, but so far has yet to do so. So it's kind of iffy as to whether or not he'll actually follow up on that. And there were over 1,500 staffers at the federal government level that wrote letters complaining about this. So again, this was not an isolated incident. This was widespread. It was well known. And yet Congress did absolutely nothing. Well, right up until the second they got caught. And then all of a sudden they had to pass this legislation and do so very quickly to make sure that they couldn't do that anymore. And so here's the thing. There are probably quite a few members of Congress that have never even thought about sexual assaulting somebody and were just as outraged when they heard about this fund as the average citizen was. But not all the ones that are voting for it. There were an awful lot of people, you can rest assured, if there were this many cases of it, that were making use of it, that are now voting against it. And yeah, maybe it was legal at the time, but that doesn't make it right. Now, I do want to compare that with what's going on with Donald Trump, and I know we've been talking a lot about him today. But I just want to make a comparison in how the media is handling it and how Democrat lawmakers are going to be handling this in the future. Let's compare that to what's going on right now with Donald Trump and the whole Michael Cohen, Stormy Daniels thing. We covered it yesterday if you want a more in-depth look at exactly what's going on over there. But when it comes to this hush money that was paid to Stormy Daniels, and here's the thing, I've said from the very beginning, I believe Donald Trump probably did actually have sex with her. He had a reputation of being kind of a terrible human being when it came to women, especially his wives. He cheated on both of his former ex-wives. It would not surprise me at all to learn that he's been cheating on Melania too. But let's look at this and break it down and make a comparison and a contrast here. Both are wrong. Both are morally reprehensible. Whether it's cheating on your wife, whether you're a government official or you're a private citizen, cheating is still cheating. But these are cases of sexual assault. And there are allegations against Donald Trump of sexual assault too, but this particular one that they're making a big deal out of with Stormy Daniels, well, that was consensual. She consented to that. And she said that she was doing so specifically to further her career. So forgive me if I don't have a whole lot of sympathy for Stormy Daniels. I'm not saying that is making what Trump did right. He's just as wrong in that as she was. Takes two to tango. But let's not pretend that she's some kind of victim here. And so that was a private citizen, not a government official, spending his own money, not taxpayer money, to cover up a consensual sexual relationship, not a sexual assault. And yet, we're seeing nonstop, wall-to-wall, 24-hour coverage of what was happening with Stormy Daniels, and right now the name escapes me, but the other porn star that he allegedly slept with. and paid hush money to. We're seeing wall-to-wall coverage of that, even though it's not a crime. Because, again, I assert that it probably happened. I think that it did. But it's still not a crime to do that. It's immoral, but it's not a crime. And then this, which is technically legal because of the way that they handled it, you have government employees that did hold office at the time using taxpayer money to fund their legal defense of sexual assault allegations. Not consensual sex, sexual assault. And yet, look at how much time and attention the media is spending on the Donald Trump story and largely ignoring this. Did you even know this was going on today? Because I found it buried pretty deep in the news cycle. And yet, this is getting almost no coverage, and the Donald Trump story is getting some. Again, I'm not trying to do whataboutism, not trying to justify what the president did, but A, it's not a crime, and B, why are you spending so much time on that story and then largely ignoring this story that involves a lot more government officials and taxpayer money? It just shows where the media's loyalties and their biases and their priorities actually lie. Now, for the daily dose of stupid.
That was stupid.
I know it was stupid.
Really stupid.
Hey, I just said it was stupid.
Today's daily dose of stupid comes brought to you by David Hogg. That's right, David Hogg, you may remember he was one of the kids in the Parkland shooting. He was sort of the ringleader when it came to March for Our Lives. And so vehemently anti-gun, despises the NRA. And he was one of the big proponents of gun control in the wake of the Parkland shooting. So David Hogg went on a tweet storm the other day. And, you know, I'm kind of upset because David Hogg was always a really easy target, and he kind of disappeared from the media for a long time. But here's David Hogg tweeting the other day, thoughts and prayers to the NRA's PR team. And what he is mentioning here is Maria Butina, I believe is the way to pronounce her name. And just to give you a little bit of background on her and what David Hogg is talking about there is Butina was a Russian spy. I guess, I don't know, I don't know how that works. I don't know if you're technically still a spy if you've got caught. I assume your profession doesn't change per se, but it's like, well, you're not really spying anymore if you've got caught. So Maria Butina was a Russian spy that infiltrated the NRA and a number of other organizations. It tried to undermine them to try to get Russia's political ideology, I guess, out there more to make Americans a little bit more pro-Russia. So here's the thing about this tweet, though. First of all, it's very snide and sarcastic. He's saying thoughts and prayers because typically what happens is when there is a shooting, Christians and other people will say, you know, our thoughts and prayers go out to the family. So he's mocking that, first of all. But I would like to point this out before we even get into the politics of this. Does anybody here actually believe that he is praying for the NRA? Or, for that matter, does anyone here actually believe that David Hogg prays, period? Because I highly doubt it. He is a foul-mouthed punk that calls regular people, you and me, I'm an NRA member too, regular American citizens saying they don't care about children getting killed. That if you're not for sweeping gun legislation, then you're a child murderer. This is his stance, and yet somehow now he's evoking spirituality, he's evoking prayer. Don't give me that. Don't give me that. This is not somebody that I would be surprised if he prays at all, much less that he's praying for the NRA. Now, I have prayed for David Hogg, and that's not to pat myself on my back. I'm just doing the bare minimum. I mean, the Bible does tell you that you're supposed to pray for your enemies. And so that's something that I've actually done. So the idea that he's actually thinking about and praying for the NRA is just beyond stupid. You can tell based on his actions and what he said in the past that there's no truth to that. And what's sad about this is he and so many other people that are pro-gun legislation are mocking people of faith. I can't tell you the number of media personalities that have come out and said, well, we don't want any more thoughts and prayers. No more thoughts and prayers. And it was Chris Matthews was one of them. There were a number on CNN. Don Lemon was one of the big ones that was mocking this. they know that they're playing to an audience that largely is secular and doesn't believe that that does any good anyway. But David Hogg is coming out and openly mocking people of faith for a political advantage because he believes that it makes his side look better politically. Ergo, he's perfectly fine with mocking people that actually pray and think that it means something when he says things like this. I mean, just a reprehensible human being. And here's another thing about this spy that infiltrated the NRA. Yes, she infiltrated the NRA and a number of other a number of other organizations. Being infiltrated does not mean that goodness knows we don't want to get infiltrated, and if we detect something that we should, but being infiltrated makes you the victim of a crime. And so the idea that, the NRA is the one that ought to be held accountable because a spy got into their network, well, that makes them the victim of spying. It doesn't mean that they were working with the spy, and this is unfortunately the stupid conclusion that Hogg and many people on the left have, is that anything connected to Russia, because they believe somehow now Republicans and conservatives are in the bed with Russia, and this is partly fueled by the idea that there are some Republicans that have a more favorable view of Russia now, according to some polling, which is also equally stupid. I don't care if it is people that are conservatives that are saying this. Russia is a threat to everybody. And anybody that doesn't see that is willfully blind, whether you're on the left or on the right. But for some reason, they believe that somehow this means that the NRA was working with the Russians. And so David Hogg says this, stupid as it may be. Care to comment on the NRA conspiring against the American people with Russia? Dana Loesch, of course, being the national spokesman for the NRA. I, for one, can't wait to see the ELOs raid your HQ. So he's alleging somehow that a spy getting into your system, that means that you were working with that. That makes no sense. If you are an organization or a country, like Russia, that is working with and conspiring with an organization, you don't have a spy there. You don't. Because there would be no reason to put a spy there. If you are, let's say if we're reverse and it was America, would America send a spy into an organization to infiltrate it if we believe that organization was friendly to us and would listen to us? No. That's why you put spies in places, because the place that they are infiltrating is hostile to you. And so if anything, Russia sending a spy to infiltrate the NRA and other organizations is pretty good evidence that the people that they believe they were infiltrating were their enemies. You don't send a spy to your friend's house. You send him to your enemy's house. And so David Hogg's stupid assertion that somehow the NRA having a spy infiltrate their ranks is proof that they were working with Russia. If anything, it's evidence to the contrary. But again, logic and reason have never exactly been David Hogg's strong suit. Because if they're sending a spy in there, wouldn't they mean that they consider the NRA a threat? Because if I were Russia, I certainly would. If I were Russia, I would want to bring down the NRA, because they're the ones defending the gun rights of Americans. And if I'm Russia, I certainly don't want to invade in America where there are people with guns. I would much rather just the military have guns. Do you have any idea how long it would take to take over this country with as much private gun ownership as we have? It'd take them a week to take Montgomery. At least, even with better equipment and better trained soldiers. Regular citizens with firearms would significantly slow down the infiltration of this country. Even if you have inferior firepower, even if you have inferior training, people with guns are a lot harder to conquer than people without guns. It's a fact. That's why dictators take away weapons rights. It's one of the first things they do, because they know that it is very difficult to subjugate people that have weapons. And so, if I were Vladimir Putin, of course I would send a spy into the NRA. I want the NRA to be broken down to where Americans don't have private gun ownership anymore. That would be my intended goal. And so if anything, you could say that the goals of the Democrat Party and the gun grabbers are aligned with Russia. Not saying they're conspiring together, because I would actually need evidence of that. Unlike David Hogg, I don't just jump to conclusions. But I'm saying that if you're looking at the stated goal of the Democrat Party and the stated goal of the gun grabbers and David Hogg and the stated goal of the Russians, which is to expand their influence and basically what Vladimir Putin said, to bring back the USSR, well, then the goals of the left and the goals of the Russians are actually aligned, at least on that issue. And so maybe you ought to think through these things before you just start pointing fingers. And what we really need to do is take a step back and look at this issue as a whole, because it happens on both sides. Happens on both sides. Because Russians have tried to break down this country. They don't care what party you are. They hate all Americans. And when I say they, I mean the Russian government, not the Russian people themselves. I'm talking specifically about the Kremlin and the people that are in power in Russia. They want to bring America down and replace us as the world superpower. That is their goal. And do you think that they're really going to come here and say, you know what, the Russians or the Republicans said some nice things to us and Trump said some nice things to us, so we're just not going to conquer that part of the country? It's not how that works. They don't like any Americans, and they will do everything in their power to bring us down as a country. That's why they're funding on both sides political discord. That's why they tried to hack our election. Every indication that we've been given is they're not playing one side or the other. They're not pro-Democrat and they're not pro-Republican. They are anti-America. And that's why the NRA is a threat to them, because the NRA is pro-America. Secretary Clinton back in 2009 and 10 was targeted by a Russian spy. By the way, this same spy that we're talking about right now, the one that David Hogg is mentioning that infiltrated the NRA, that did really happen. You know what else was going on with that same spy? She met with Federal Reserve Vice Chairman Stanley Fischer and Treasury Undersecretary Nathan Sheets in 2015. Wait a second. 2015. That would have meant the president who oversaw that would be Barack Obama, which means, again, more evidence that the Russians are trying to bring down America as a whole, not one party or the other. It does not benefit them for the Republicans to be in power or the Democrats to be in power. They wanted influence into the Clinton campaign, they wanted influence into the Obama administration, and they also want influence in the Trump administration. They want to bring down America from within, and they don't care what administration gets brought down in the process, as long as the country as a whole is weakened. That is their final goal. Russia is the enemy of America, and they don't care which party you're in. And this is the real problem. We are so busy right now fighting each other, we're ignoring the common enemy. We're so busy with this political struggle. Every time something happens with the Russians, be it Democrat, Republican, we all jump at each other and start fighting with each other. That's exactly what Russia wants. You're looking at what's playing out in Ukraine and all across Europe. A lot of that, not all of it, but a lot of that is Vladimir Putin's doing. And part of it is because they are sowing the seeds of discord, trying to increase their own power, because a weaker Europe and a weaker America means that Russia is in a better position to either take over or at least have a stronger influence at the very least. And so what is really tragic is that we are so busy fighting amongst ourselves and being at each other's throats that we are ignoring the common enemy, which is Russia. And that's an enemy that we're going to have to stand united against. And if we do not, then we are not going to succeed against them. Chaplin's report is up next.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Chaplin's report today comes from the book of Galatians, and I want to go ahead and get straight into the scripture on this one. Now, just to give you a little bit of context, remember that at this particular point, Paul has been talking to them about this contrast between the old and new law. And he says in Galatians 5:13 and 15, "For you were called to freedom, brethren, only do not turn your freedom into an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, in the statement, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, take care that you are not consumed by one another." So there is a wealth of information contained within those 3 verses, and it does help to remember in this context that Paul was specifically speaking to the churches at Galatia that were having struggles between Jewish and Gentile Christians. The Jewish Christians wanted to implement ideas of the old law. The Gentile Christians were saying, no, you just get rid of all that stuff. You just live the way that you're supposed to. And the Gentile Christians were technically correct, but this was causing discord amongst the brothers. And that wasn't good. Even for the people that were right, it's not good to sow discord among your brethren. And so this is something that Paul gives a very clear format on, and this is something that it's so indicative of who Paul is in his writing. Paul presents the problem. He says, here's what the problem is. Here is the solution. Here's how to implement the solution. And so doesn't waste any words in a very concise manner. He gives us problem, solution, how to implement the solution. So if you'll look back at that text, the problem is people using their freedom as an opportunity for the flesh. In other words, temptation, binding different burdens on people, binding the law on them where it's not necessary. And then he says that this is happening, and the solution is love your neighbor as yourself. Pretty simple solution. And how do you implement that? Well, in the next verse, in verse 15, he says, take care that you are not consumed by one another. So, problem, solution, how to implement the solution. So this issue that he's talking about, where there were Jewish Christians trying to push the old law on them, or people that were being involved in temptation because they had this liberty, Gentile Christians that were saying, well, since I'm under grace, I can just sin and it'll be fine. I can sin and then ask for forgiveness later and I'll be forgiven and all will be well. No, that's not the right attitude to have either. And so don't use that freedom that you have been given, because under the old law, it was very strict. It was very specific. There were certain rituals that you had to partake in that are not continued under the new law. And so because they have all this freedom, all this liberty that was not so under the law of Moses, he says that there are some people that are using that extra freedom as an excuse to sin or as an excuse to not do the things that they were supposed to do. Well, what's the solution to that? Love your neighbor as yourself. If you just follow that principle, where you put other people's needs ahead of your own, you're going to be working in such a way that is mutually beneficial to both of you, that you can both spiritually mature based on one another's example. And so each person needs to be looking out for the other's interest, and doing that will solve the problem. Well, how do we implement that problem? Because that's really hard to do. And Paul is saying the way to implement it is, if you're sitting there biting one another, eventually you're going to consume one another. And if you keep that in mind, if you remember that your brothers and sisters are there to help you, and that engaging in this kind of back and forth to where you're constantly taking jabs at one another is just destroying you from within, then you're going to remember that and realize sometimes it's better to go back to the golden rule. That's how to implement the solution that he is giving. We cannot use our freedom as a license to sin, because we are freed from those old laws and traditions. See, this was the difference in the old and the new law that Paul is trying to point out here. We had the law of Moses and then the law of the heart. The law of Moses dealt largely with the physical world and the actions that we took. And that wasn't necessarily a bad thing for its time. It served a purpose. For example, Jesus gives a great commentary on this in the Sermon on the Mount. He said, it's bad to commit adultery. But if you're looking at women with lust in your eyes, then for you, that's just as bad. Granted, you're not involving anybody else in that, but you are adopting the attitude and the mentality of someone who commits adultery. And that puts you at odds with God just as much as committing the actual act of adultery would be. And so that's really why he's trying to make this contrast between the old law and the new law. He's saying, you have a lot of liberty. You have a lot of freedom that you did not have under the old law. But because you're under the law of the heart, you are now actually held to a higher standard. You have more freedom, but that also means you have more responsibility. You can't just say, well, I'm in accordance with the law because I've never committed adultery. You have to actually commit yourself daily to not even think about it. And that's true when it comes to, for another example that Jesus used, when it came to human relationships. It's bad to murder somebody, but if you're harboring hatred for someone and want terrible things to happen to them and treat them horribly because of that, is that really a whole lot better? You may not be breaking the law of Moses, but you are breaking the law of the heart. You're breaking the intent behind that law, that we're supposed to love one another. And so this is really the standard that Paul is giving. Problem, solution, how to implement the solution. If you remember that your brothers and sisters are there to help you, and you look at them as a resource to encourage you to do good, you're not going to be nearly as inclined to attack one another. Because the church, it was true in Paul's day, it's true now. It is under attack from the world, constantly. It never lets up. It may, it may seem as though it's not happening at sometimes more so than it is others. For example, there's a difference in physical persecution, actually killing Christians that believe, and just persecuting people by making them an outcast. But the point is, it is under constant attack all the time regardless. And if we're not aware of that, if we're busy fighting one another inside the church as brothers and sisters in Christ, we're going to be ignoring the more serious threat from the outside. We cannot fight as an army if we're too busy fighting each other. And the solution to that, as Paul pointed out, is just to remember the teachings of Jesus Christ, that we're supposed to love our neighbor as ourselves. Stay the course, friends.